This lecture will focus on American imperialism. American imperialism is the effort when we move from isolation to expanding the American influence around the world. If you look at the political cartoon on this page, it demonstrates that. When the United States sort of started, the eagle was just over the continental United States, but by 1898, it's expanding across the oceans, those wings all the way across the oceans, including places like Puerto Rico, Manila, Philippines, Hawaii, Samoa Islands. And if you look at the bottom where it says 1798, you can see just that little portion up to the Mississippi River. Okay, but now we've gone so much farther, and that's sort of the idea. How did we get into American imperialism is really the focus of this lecture. Before the 1880s, America was in the establishment of isolationism. Isolationism is the idea that we worried about our own issues and not the issues about anywhere else in the world. We focus on manifest destiny, expanding across the continental United States, past the Mississippi River, across the Great Plains, across the Rockies, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's all about the U.S., not about them anywhere else. Yes, we created the Monroe Doctrine, sort of the idea that Western Europeans should not interfere in our hemisphere. But the biggest focus during this time was about our expansion, our movement west, and not necessarily what was going on throughout the rest of the world. So, why did we expand? Part of it was nationalism. There was this focus that we, as the Anglo-Saxon race, were the best. We had the best political systems with democracy. We had the best religious systems with Christianity. And that Anglo-Saxonism, that idea that whites should move further and spread what we know is best, was one of the big ideas. Manifest destiny. We expanded all the way from sea to shining sea, but was that enough? Was that going to give us enough natural resources? Was it going to give us enough markets? Was that going to give us enough opportunities to escape or to find new things? Remember that draw of the West is going to continue to pull us farther. Social Darwinism. Just like applying Darwin's theory of evolution, where the stronger controls the weak, we don't just apply it to society, but we can also apply it to nations. Isn't it fitting that the weaker nations are controlled by the stronger ones? That was the belief of social Darwinists as they applied it to imperialism. So when we talk about intervening in other nations, we were trying to quote unquote better them. And in doing that, we were trying to exert our influence. Militarism, the building up of your military and using it as a tool of diplomacy. So in other words, we're going to have our presidents build up our navy like Teddy Roosevelt does with the Great White Fleet. We're going to try to exert our military throughout the world. But not only do we need to be able to exert our military, we need bases for them. And the biggest thing we need is naval bases to be able to get them around the world. So that's why we end up with Pearl Harbor. That's why we end up with Guantanamo Bay. That's why we end up with places like Guam and the Samoa Islands. In order to have those bases around the world for us to be able to then compete around the world and be able to send our military. And then mercantilism. It's come back. And the idea that if the value of our exports is greater than the value of our imports, that we make more money. And this is how we're going to try to exert ourselves. So first, we start with the Pacific expansion. Commodore Matthew Perry goes to Japan. And on his way to try to take over Japan, he finds a perfect way station, Hawaii. Hawaii was being controlled by American sugar growers. The first people to arrive in Hawaii were merchants and missionaries. But then later they discovered that if they owned the sugar plantations, they were going to make up a large portion of wealth. They were going to end up controlling 75% of the island's wealth. In 1887, the U.S. pressured Hawaii to allow a naval base at Pearl Harbor, which becomes a refueling station. However, in 1890, when the McKinley Tariff eliminates duty-free status of Hawaiian sugar becomes very expensive. And so American planters decide the only way to avoid the tariff is to become a territory or a state. And so they call for the U.S. to annex the island so they wouldn't have to pay for this tariff. In 1891, Queen Leleilani took the throne and tries to restore previously lost monarch powers. However, planters, the American planters who wanted to annex it, were worried that they were going to be able to lose control. So they stage a revolution and they ask the U.S. for support, and Grover Cleveland will send in U.S. Marines to help force her to step down. Cleveland refuses to annex it, but McKinley accepts, and in 1898, Hawaii will become a U.S. territory. You'll notice that Hawaii is on the way to Japan, and so it's going to be the perfect sort of halfway point in order to be that refueling station in order to compete in Japan and eventually China. Then we end up with the Spanish-American War. Some of the causes were the Cuban Revolution. In 1895, the Cubans decided to rebel against the Spanish-controlled area. And one of the most famous leaders was a guy named Jose Marti, who was killed during the revolution. He had been living in the United States in New York, and so there was a lot of attention paid to this. Then we have yellow journalism. These are sensationalized stories to attract attention. This is sort of like the National Enquirer or even Star Magazine. Almost People, but not quite. There's kernels of truth in the stories, but for the most part, they've sensationalized it, over-dramatized it. And so if you think about it, we have yellow journalism, people who are over-dramatizing the stories up against muckrakers who are trying to expose the truth. And both are competing for space in the newspapers. You have the Delome letter, which was a Spanish minister who mocked McKinley and said that he was a weak president and a bidder for admiration of the crowd. Now, the thing is that a lot of Americans thought that McKinley was a weak man. Matter of fact, Teddy Roosevelt, his own vice president, said that McKinley had the same backbone as a chocolate eclair. So he wasn't necessarily well thought of. But there's one thing when we mock our presidents, a whole other thing when foreign dignitaries do. And so we became very offended. We felt that the Spanish were against us. And then the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898. And at that point, even though later we find out that it wasn't the Spanish who attacked it, but rather that it was a boiler explosion, McKinley feels that this is enough of an act that he can call for war. The war's fought on two fronts. The Navy is going to take the Manila Bay off the coast of the Philippines, and troops en route will take Guam. And then the other side is in Cuba. Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders help take San Juan Hill. The Spanish fleet tries to leave the harbor right into the waiting American battleships. And we have over 2,000 deaths from disease. There's very, very few deaths actually from actual battle. I think it was less than 400. But you have lots that will die from yellow fever, from bad meat, all sorts of problems like that. So the end of the war is signed with the Treaty of Paris, 1898. Cuba kind of gets freedom with the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment said that U.S. would control their foreign policy. So they needed to have some sort of agreement with the U.S. in order to be able to run their own country. They couldn't write their constitution without U.S. interference. Guam is annexed. Puerto Rico is annexed. And will later, the Puerto Rican people will later become American citizens, as will Guam citizens. And then there was a big thing about Philippines. Do we annex them or do we not annex them? Now, McKinley felt we should annex them because we needed to Christianize and educate, as he said, our little brown brothers. Of course, that's that social Darwinism, that's the Anglo-Saxonism that comes back. The Filipinos were not happy about this. They had actually supported Commodore Dewey and his invasion into the Philippines because they thought they were fighting the Spanish for their own independence. And the Emilio Aguinaldo, who's the picture up here, he helped the Americans in overthrowing the Spanish. But when the Americans said, oh, no, you're not ready to govern yourselves, we then have the Philippine-American War, the Philippine Insurrection, where Taft was the first civilian governor there. And, of course, Taft will later become a president. So the Filipinos were not happy. They revolt. We end up with a 4-year war where all sorts of atrocities were committed against the Filipino people. For example, one general said that he would go into villages, kill anyone over the age of 10. There was definitely search and destroy missions that would go in where they'd go and look and they'd burn everything in their path. All sorts of problems there, and it was a 4-year war. It only ended when they captured Emilio Aguinaldo, and he was forced to sign a declaration declaring his allegiance to the United States and urging his people to give up their battle. The Filipinos won't be granted their independence until 1946. Okay, so you'll see there we have Cuba, which is 90 miles off the coast of the United States. Remember, they have somewhat independence. You have Puerto Rico, which becomes an American territory. Guam, which is near the Philippines. You can see how it's like right on the way from Hawaii. And then, of course, the Philippines. Last but not least, we have the Opendoor Policy. The U.S. had a deep interest in China. China had a vast potential market with investment opportunity. France, Britain, Japan, Russia had settlements in China or spheres of influence. You can sort of see the colors on that map up there of where they had their spheres of influence and where they were controlling the markets. U.S. Secretary of State John Hay issued the Open Door Notes, where he asked imperialist nations to share trading rights with the U.S. and respect Chinese law. Some people said, sure, not a problem. Other people were like, no, we can't do this unless everyone agrees. And then other people said, no, it's not going to happen. When the Boxer Rebellion happens, 200 foreigners were killed, and this rebellion was smashed by troops from imperialists, including the United States. At this point, it was decided not to partition China, but instead to accept compensation for damages from the Chinese government. So we end up with a sphere of influence in China. Though we don't control a certain region, instead we are participating in the market, and we end up with interests there. The next lecture will be focusing on presidential policies during imperialism.